Hello everyone and welcome to the NSUN AGM 2020, newly online, and it's my second AGM. I'm still a fairly new member, and I'm an even newer trustee, as I'll talk about introducing myself. But this is the panel on LGBTQ plus and survivor activism, so kind of exploring potential intersections but also gaps and ways in which LGBTQ plus activism and experience can speak to or not mental health, survivor lived experience and activism as well. So it's about an hour-long discussion. It's going to be sort of mainly kind of an informal conversation between myself and our amazing panelists. I'm really excited. So what I will do is I will allow them to introduce themselves as well. And I will go first, kind of as an example, and because I know I'm probably new to a lot of you, not just the panel as well. Okay, so to keep it under time, I've actually written it down for a change. Go on. So I'm Aimz Rushton. So I also go by Aimz. So you might hear some of the panelists refer to me as Aimz, and that's totally okay. And my pronouns are they, them, their. So I identify kind of as sort of femme, non-binary, and a queer lesbian, essentially. So I'm a member of NSUN, and I've served as a trustee since 2019. So as a queer person, homophobia and misogyny obviously have had a profound impact on my well-being since I was a kid. However, my distress was furthered by negative experiences of health services, misunderstanding and dismissal of my gender and sexuality. This is, unfortunately, a common story for user survivors across the LGBTQ plus communities. And this is one of the reasons why I know that myself and Amy Wells and we really wanted to put together this panel, and Akiko Hart was really supportive of that as well. So one of the things that I sort of sent a bit of a prompt across for the panelists, so they're going to introduce themselves and also I think speak to this prompt as well, is kind of broadly, what for you is the biggest challenge concerning LGBTQ plus well-being in our current moment? Because I've referenced in my own introductions a huge history between kind of LGBTQ plus mistreatment, thinking about homosexuality and sort of transgender being categorized as illnesses for, in the official medical discourse for such a long time as well. So before I turn to the panelists and let them to introduce themselves and give their response, my response to what for me is kind of the biggest concern, LGBTQ plus wellbeing at the moment. So clearly there's still plenty of work to be done to support LGBTQ plus folks' wellbeing. However, my biggest concern are the particular challenges facing Black, QTI, POC and all trans people in our current moment, for reasons that I'm sure that we'll probably go into and you're probably all aware of at the moment as well. So in this panel, as well as discussing what mental health, trans and QTI POC groups can learn from each other, I also hope we can identify the gaps and possibilities of mutual support between lived experience of LGBTQ plus folks and user survivors in mental health as well. Okay, so that kind of gives you an idea of what this first part of the panel is going to be like. So I'm going to turn to each panelist as they appear on my screen. So it might not make much sense on the recording, but we'll see. So I'm going to turn to MJ Barker first. So MJ, if you could introduce yourself.
Thank you so much. Yeah, my name's Meg-John Barker, or MJ for short, and I use they, them pronouns. And primarily these days I'm a writer about queer and mental health issues. So you can find those on my website, rewritingtherules.com. So I've written Queer a Graphic History is probably the most popular book that I've written about this stuff. In terms of introducing myself more personally, I was thinking about, we were asked to sort of talk about our own gender, sexuality and relationship with mental health. So I guess I would usually say my gender is trans, non-binary, my sexuality is queer. And in terms of mental health, the situation for me is being a survivor of developmental and other forms of trauma, and also experienced myself as plural. So I guess under the kind of more psychiatric categories, something like post-traumatic stress and dissociative identity disorder would be the ones that would be applied to me. And when I was thinking about the answer to that question of like, what's my gender, my sexuality and my mental health, it kind of occurred to me that actually that feels increasingly like quite a false separation for me. Like, you know, my gender, my sexuality, and my mental health status are all kind of trans, they're all kind of queer, they're all kind of plural, they're all kind of traumatized. And I suppose, you know, that takes me to something I'd love to explore in this panel at some point, about whether even we could separate out gender and sexuality activism and mental health activism, or whether there's actually even quite a problem in that idea of separating those two things out as things that could learn from each other, and maybe the thing would be to more try and bring them together again. I think that will do as a kind of opener from me. Thanks.
Oh, that's fantastic, MJ. And Suriya, could I come to you next, please, if you would mind introducing yourself and your background?
Thanks, Aimz. Yeah, my name's Suriya. My pronouns are she and her, and I am an artist and an activist. And so some of the activism that I do is that I'm the founder of a cutie pot group in Birmingham called Unmuted Brum, which is a network for queer and Black people of colour. And I'm also co-director along with Sabah of Colour's Youth Network, which is for younger LGBT people of colour. And so, and as an artist, I guess I'm a writer and explore themes about kind of, I say like the extraordinary in the everyday, but a lot of it is influenced by mental health and kind of particular traumas that I might have experienced. So I'm a Black queer disabled woman. So some of the traumas that I've experienced are to do with being disabled and being undiagnosed for a long time, and also then experiencing the health system as a Black woman, as a young person at the time, because a lot of the time our understanding of disability and illness erases a lot of young people, and I was quite young when I needed to be diagnosed. And I guess being a Black person living in Britain, I'm acknowledging that as a trauma. I think because as I read more about trauma, I know now that it's not just about some of those potential big events that we understand it can be. It can be small. There's small microaggressions that we experience every day. My experience of schooling was I experienced a lot of racism in school. And I'm quite traumatized from that. And then also from some of the things that have happened in my personal life. I live with post-traumatic stress disorder as well. So yeah, I agree with what you said earlier, MJ. How do we separate all those things? Because we are all of those things. It's hard to think about which bit is influenced by this, which bit's influenced by that. So I'm looking forward to having that conversation with you all today as well. Do you want me to answer the question about what are we, the LGBT current moment? Okay. Yeah, I would agree with what you said earlier about, I think specifically for Black people right now, we've had we've got this biggest civil rights movement in history happening with Black Lives Matter, and people being awakened to the audacities and trauma that's happened to Black people overtly and in the systemic way. And I was thinking actually the other day about, we have this new layer as well of the performative activism and the kind of becoming people wanting to be allies and also or accomplices or whatever they might label it as. But in the process of that, it feels almost like Black people are being dehumanized in a way that it becomes like a prop on Instagram, which I feel like for me personally, especially over lockdown, I felt that pressure and the trauma that happens of going online and seeing yourself talked about as something that can prop up other people. And it feels like people are still not really seeing what is going on for Black people. And then on top of that, Black queer people, queer and trans people. Thank you.
And thank you for sharing particularly that last part as well. That's something that I definitely would really like to talk about, because thinking about it does seem to be, and I've noticed, we'll talk about it I know in a bit, but I've noticed myself that there's an awful lot of kind of mental health kind of pressure and distress related to kind of this like performative or kind of almost like unthinking sharing of posts as well. And it does seem to be particularly harmful for like Black queer friends of mine as well, and being mindful of that. So yeah, thank you for flagging that, and that's definitely something we'll turn to as well. The next on my screen is lovely Kes. So Kes, would you be okay to introduce yourself and also offer a response if you feel fit?
Kes Lieffe, I use she, her pronouns. It's always quite hard for me to prioritize what to talk about. I've been community organizing for 20-something years, increasingly around like queer and trans stuff. run a small collective called Transfeminism International, which is a little bit kind of responding to the fact that a lot of queer trans organizing often has like a middle class leadership, or it often has like like privileged leadership, and so that ends up like prioritizing those people. Whereas I'm a sex worker, I'm working class, chronically ill, all the things, some of the things, and so yeah, like working around like incarceration because my friends are incarcerated and things like this. So it's like maybe a different starting point in terms of prioritizing material needs, because I was never really in like academic world, like everything that's like anything that's like a bit abstract. I'm like, okay, but like, what does this mean if you're homeless? So I guess, yeah, that's some of the work that I'm doing right now. I'm also an author, and for sure I write about mental health stuff in a way. I live with CPTSD, like complex PTSD, and anxiety and all kinds of other things. So in a way, I think, yeah, they are a little bit impossible to separate. Obviously, like some of the trauma is from trans misogyny and transphobic violence and classism and all the things. And sometimes it is really useful to separate things, because it can be like, okay, like this is this community and we're focusing on this. This is a different space, we're focusing on this. It is okay to separate things. And also sometimes they're very, very entwined, and you're like, actually, well, we can't deal with this unless we deal with this at the same time. And I think that's when we're strongest in a way. And I think maybe I'm already answering the question. I think like the spaces and the I guess movements that have most inspired me, or I felt best in, is when we can put everything on the table and understand that it's really complex. And I think that's a really big challenge, not just because it's like, oh wow, that's a lot of work. I think often we can just be very kind of caught up in our specific experiences of oppression, and that's super fine. It's like, you know, I definitely do that. But I feel like sometimes we end up kind of like fighting with each other because we're all a bit messed up and we've all been like traumatized. And I think when I feel like best with people is when we're like, okay, like, wow, you have that one, like, let me know how to show up for that. I have this. Do you want to show up for that as well? And we can like find ways forward where, that we can talk about a lot of different things and hold all of that without all the insecurities of like either like fragile privileged people or everyone being really traumatized and we can't be in a room together, which is real. You know, I experience that as well. Sometimes I'm like, oh my gosh, like it's too much. And we can do something else. We can create a context where we're like, okay, like let's put it all on the table. Let's talk about all these things. Let's do all the work for everyone. It's just a bit more complex, maybe. I think that I kind of answered the question.
No, you absolutely did. And I think, Kes, that was amazing. And I'm so glad you mentioned about the class element as well, because I think something that I think it might actually, this could be a bit of forewarning, it might end up being the first question, but thinking about sort of talking off the back of Suriya's introduction as well, and also MJ already, is this thinking about how, you know, boundaries can be both, you know, be impractical and not very useful, but as you say, sometimes actually, you know, are necessary. But it's, I think there is something around the ways in which we have these conversations, and I'll see what you guys think about this when we get to the discussion. But I think for me, sort of folks, actually I should say that for you folks, for me, I think, you know, there's something often around, I think, like when people already have multiple kind of oppressions going on, there seems to be more of a burden for them to kind of collapse those boundaries, and that's something I think we could definitely talk about. But last but certainly not least is Sabah. So Sabah, if you would care to introduce yourself and maybe respond to the response, if you response to the prompt if you feel fit for it as well.
Thank you, and thank you for having me, NSUN. I'm really excited about this conversation, and just already I'm just like, wait, I just want to talk to like Kes and MJ and Suriya. My names are all of this. So my name is Sabah. My pronouns are they, them, and theirs most of the time. I am an able-bodied, transmasculine, gender fluid, gender still figuring it out person of color. I'm Muslim. I am often passed through the world as someone who looks like a cisgender man. and I live in London. And also really like cats, which is a very important part of my identity. So I'm also a freelance writer and speaker. I also sit with Suriya with Colours and Youth Network, and the role I'm in today is as the head of youth service at Gender Intelligence, so a youth organisation who support trans and non-binary young people and children and families and the communities who also impact our lives in the UK. I've been doing youth work since 2014, and before that I label myself as a reluctant activist. And I think that's a really important part of my my own understanding of my mental health. And it's funny actually, because I don't know why it always surprises me, but I just never, I don't find myself actually talking about mental health like explicitly. I don't know. And today I was like, oh, like mental health, when did I last say those words out loud? But I think it's because it's so woven into the conversations I have and like our practices as like trans communities or queer communities or communities of color. I'm laughing at myself because I'm also a psychotherapist in training, so like mental health is kind of a thing, but again it's so much embedded in my way of being, I guess. And I think sometimes, Kes, there was something you said about was it boundaries or care, but I think so often the question isn't like, how can I look after my mental health? It's like, how can I care for myself? How can I care for my communities? Like, have we learned how to care for ourselves? I don't know. I just end up with loads of questions. Yeah, going back to kind of this reluctant activist, I think, especially for people who are, who straddle different identities, or who are kind of like the only XYZ in a village or something, we often have to carry a lot of that work and that representation. And I think, especially as a young person, this is when I was a young person, I think I was so desperate to see a change and to feel looked after by other communities that I didn't really think about what I needed or who I wanted to be looking after me or around me. I think it probably touches on like that tokenism that Suriya was mentioning as well, like the performativity of what it means to feel included and cared for and seen as a person of color, as a Black person, as a queer person, etc. I've lost my train of thought. Can you ask me the question again, and then I'll get back on track, or we can just move on? It's
Well, no, Sabah, actually, that's excellent, because it's actually, you're speaking to that response. She's like, what is the biggest concern at the moment? And I think what you were saying there is this sense of care, and I think in some ways that might be like a good starting point as well for the conversation. I was really interested when you were saying actually about how mental health doesn't seem to be part of that kind of like everyday kind of conversation for you, but actually it's professionally and personally such like an intertwined part there as well.
A lot of my work as a facilitator, as a youth worker, includes care. It's all focused around the idea of caring, around the idea of well-being, which I think in a way is a resistance kind of ethos and a kind of collectivist decolonial ethos, that it's like you're not trying to fix a broken thing, you're just trying to enable a state of people being well and cared for and connected to each other. I think sometimes maybe potentially why the idea of mental health can be separated from us is because it feels very medicalized in situations where we're being dehumanized, and also sometimes when we've got that diagnosis of what our mental health challenge is, haven't felt cared for or seen in that moment anyway. It's just kind of the thing that you need to put on the form to get to the next thing or whatever it might be. Because even me having recently the label of PTSD was so that I can access a particular type of therapy. But it was only after 2 years of working with a talking therapist, who's a Black woman, where she actually even said though the label of that. I think we were already working with the challenges that I was having as a result of, but I think potentially her way of being with me is to not say, this is what I think you've got, so then you can be kind of worried about that. It was more, what can we do to make sure that your life is beneficial in the here and now? But it wasn't until the point where she was like, I feel like you might need this, so how about like I'll tell you that I think this is what you need to tick so that you can get to the thing. But even having that, even saying it, it's a weird it's complex, I think, diagnosis and the term mental health or mental illness. And so yeah, I definitely feel what you said, Sabah, earlier about care, wellbeing, collectivism. I feel like that features in my work a lot, and I feel like I connect to that a lot more every day.
Oh, I just really love what you said, Suriya, about care as resistance. That was really nice. And I was just trying to think like what it is about care for me. And I think it's because I didn't know that activism and mental health support were different things. Like, I think when I was younger, and like I said, that reluctant activism, it was something that I just ended up doing and didn't really I knew that it wasn't giving me everything I needed, but I couldn't put the two things together. But now I'm just like, yeah, these things are very different. Activism, mental health support, and even giving care to ourselves, they're separate things, and I think we need to remember that. I think that's why I found myself like burnt out quite a lot, and I just kind of kept going. I think it's only recently that I've actually learned to ask myself that question, like, well, not even find the answers, but yeah, learning how to ask myself the question, like, how do I care for myself, before I even figure out the answers. And I think on kind of more of a personal note, I never really had that space to do that. I was caring for my dad for many years, so I was always in the position of caring for others, and with youth work and therapy and being a psychotherapist as well. And there was something that my friend said last year that really stuck with me, and that was, caregivers need care. And I was like, oh yeah, no, that's really not what I'm getting right now. And I think that's something we really need to remember. I think maybe I think all of us here as people in our communities, we're constantly caring and looking after each other, just in our nature, like our friends who are also queer and trans and people of color, but we also need that care too. Yeah, that's all I really wanted to say, but MJ, over to you.
Oh, thanks. Now I've got stuff I want to respond to from both of those. That was really smart. Yeah, I suppose really my work has always been informed by this sense of really want to get this idea out there that a lot of the problem with mental health struggles of various kinds is this individualizing of what are actually systemic and structural problems. So I've written quite a few books that I call anti-self-help, because it's kind of about trying to lift it away from the self and be like, the problems are out there. They're in the cultural messages, they're in the unjust systems and structures, they're not in the individual, but we bear the brunt of it. So I guess that's how it really shows up in my writing. Like, that's the thing I'm really passionate about. And that also, I think, involves normalizing the struggles as well, though. And so I do write really openly, like more and more so, about trauma and how that experiences for me. And again, yeah, like really questioning this notion of that we could separate like this individualized self-care, which we need to do. I think we do need to do our work kind of understanding, what's the constellation of factors that are going on for us from our lives, from the culture around us, and how they show up for us. And then there are kind of tools that we can use individually, but it's got to be in the context of systems and structures of support. Like, I don't believe that we can do this individual work without systems and structures that support us. Like, if all of the systems and structures around us are really non-consensual, then we can't practice self-consent and consent with others. And if they're really uncaring and we're not encouraged to do the kind of care that Sabah and Suriya were talking about, then we're not going to be able to do it ourselves. So again, lifting that pressure off the individual, because I think, again, out there in wider culture, there's this idea of like, you should just slap on some self-care, slap on some mindfulness, and then you can survive these really toxic systems. No, we need to change the really toxic systems. That's just so important.
Oh, thanks, MJ. And Kes, I think, have you got anything you'd like to respond to or add to this prompt?
Thanks. Yeah. I love that we're talking about care. I think it's one of my top 3 subjects that I like to talk about or think about. I think it's so big, right? It's so I think I really noticed how it was missing in so many places that I was organizing, and how that's like has a very specific, some very specific reasons and privileges there. And I think, yeah, the places that I love most are when like that's really, really at the foreground in a way, because what is, you know, I think of it as prefigurative politics, by which I mean like doing what we want to exist in the future, doing it right now. And if we're not taking care of each other right now, and we're like burning ourselves out and burning each other out for some like great revolutionary future or something, then like what is the point? And I want to do it like right now. And yeah, I think, you know, you mentioned like queer and trans spaces as often like people like expressing their needs or taking care of each other. I do have that experience sometimes, I think, in terms of like centering the most marginalized or like actually like taking care of each other. Sometimes it works really well and sometimes it really doesn't work. And it's clear which one I prefer. I think that, you know, it is fundamental. And like, yeah, as I said, I've been like organizing in some shape or form for decades, and burnout is a real thing. Supporting each other is a real thing. The trauma of organizing and like the idea of reluctant activism as well. I love that. Like, I think that makes sense to me. Like sometimes I'm just like, well, what else could I do? I have to survive. This is actually survival activism. It's not like, for me, it's not just like a nice choice to be a professional. I don't, you know, have any income, so that doesn't really work. So there's something. Yeah, I think people can come to it from different places, and yeah, there are some people who can just burn out or sell out, and I think that's something that was something really painful for me. Was seeing like a lot of middle class, I don't know, comrades, I guess, just kind of got bored. Like it was like a fun thing to do at uni or something, and I was like, oh, for me, this is like survival. This is not something I elect. This isn't something that you kind of like do for a little while and then, you know. Which is not to like negate burnout because it's very, very real, but I think it's interesting who can kind of opt in for a little while and then kind of get bored of it and then get a nice job in Daddy's bank or something. And yeah, for some of us, it just isn't an option. I can't think of anything else. This is just how we get by. And when that's the case, then we need a lot of care for each other. Like it is really, really hard work. Like being real, it is not a fun thing to do. It can be the most beautiful, empowering, inspiring, everything else. And sometimes it's just like a ton of really hard work. We're like taking on systems of oppression. That's going to be really hard. And yeah, the last thing I wanted to say, I think I work as a body worker as well. And I think it's been really interesting, that kind of dynamic of like seeing people individually and knowing that like no matter what work we do together, if they're experiencing some kind of oppression, they leave the clinic and then that oppression didn't go anywhere. So we're kind of always just like bailing water out of the boat, or I don't have a good metaphor, but you know what I mean? And so it absolutely has to be in that context of social change, which doesn't mean that I specifically have to do all those things, or any one of us has to do all of those things. We can, you know, I think it's really great that someone's like a trans competent mental health worker or something. I think that, you know, we can be specific. But I think for me, there always needs to be this like wider context of like deconstructing all the things that are causing those problems as well, at the same time as like meeting people individually.
Thank you, Kes, and thank you, everybody. That was that. I mean, I've got so many thoughts kind of flying around my head, and just to kind of flag up what has been said, that Suriya, that idea about, you know, like care is resistance is so key, and you know, I really relate to that in terms of, you know, my kind of own experience and also kind of like the research that I've been doing, thinking about particularly you know, indigenous knowledges and thinking around kind of mental, you know, a mental distress, and you know, actually these much older knowledges, noticing that, you know, like I said, like, as MJ was saying, it isn't about individualism. It's this kind of, it's neoliberalism, it's a neoliberal society that makes, you know, that adds to these burdens as well. But before, I'm not going to go into research mode. That's a totally different thing. But I did want to pick up on something that that came up a lot also around this idea of care and responsibility. And I thought, actually, Kes, you were saying you didn't think it was the right metaphor, but actually that idea about, was it bailing water out of the boat? I think is really apt. And I was wondering actually, kind of thinking about the spaces that, you know, we do or don't have access to as queer people and trans people, but also thinking about this idea of opting in and opting out. And that's certainly been my experience from thinking about a work point of view, where, you know, I sort of teach and research a lot around thinking about, you know, forms of narratives of mental health as forms of as forms of resistance, and particularly because personally, you know, a lot of my kind of, you know, and again intertwined mental, you know, my experiences, mental distress, you know, depression, PTSD have actually been most kind of supported and articulated by you know, black, queer and trans people of colour, in particular those sort of scholars like, you know, Audre Lorde is that the really obvious one for me. But I think what's fascinating is that when it comes to teaching, actually people don't necessarily want to hear kind of my experiences. They don't necessarily see my experiences as someone, as a user survivor of mental health services, as valuable, but they somehow kind of have commodified my queerness in a way that actually I've had no say over and I'm not comfortable with, because actually that's not necessarily how I sort of position myself in. I'm more interested in talking about anti-colonial ideas, of thinking about you know, again, this is a bit problematic because it's opting in and out as a, you know, as a white scholar, as a white teacher from that. But I think there's something kind of interesting that we're talking about here, about this idea about opting in and out of spaces. And I think, and something that came up a little bit in the introductions was this idea of often like the burdens, or for perhaps a less negative word, like the responsibilities, you know, as queer people, then especially as, you know, queer and or trans people, and then especially even, you know, as someone who's from a racialized community, you know, black, or, you know, however identify. So I mean, this might be something, like thinking about, we're obviously having a conversation amongst ourselves at the moment, but this is going to be like a public conversation. Is there anything, like, will this be a kind of a good opportunity to kind of speak to some things that you would like to see change? And I'm not asking you to have answers for this at all, but it's kind of throwing ideas out, particularly framed through 2020 and how difficult it's been, and thinking about caring responsibilities, you know, disability, kind of race issues, in terms of thinking about how finally that sort of finally thing is seeking momentum, but also trans issues. So if there's kind of something like, you know, one or two areas that, you know, you would like to see change, I'd be really interested. I think we'd all be really, you know, everyone would be really interested to hear this. Like I said, it's not asking for answers in any way. It's just thinking about, like, you know, like for you, what could be the most significant change or adjustment or acknowledgement that you'd like to have in, you know, out there, wherever there is.
I've been reflecting, I think probably on the last 8 months now. Have we been in lockdown? I can't remember.
10 years?
Exactly. And I've been thinking about what's changed for me personally, because I think what happens is, what I'm interested in is, like, how much does what sometimes I refer to as noise online reach the people who are the community that people are talking about? So, you know, if I go on Instagram, I feel like, oh, the world's really changed. Everyone's talking about these things. My day-to-day around my life, I don't know if I'm safe in my community. I don't know what's changed. I don't know if people are looking out for me as a disabled person in my immediate space. So I think what I mean, and that's what I think, being, you know, on social media right now, it's really, I find it really difficult to be on there, because I feel like everyone has a hot take and everyone's saying everything. But I just feel like, who's there showing up, and who has been there, and who will continue to do the work? I know that it's going to be the same people who were there before lockdown, or potentially a few little more. And I think what I've been trying to think about is what would help change that. And I think a lot of it is about reflection and personal reflection of what is driving you to make a movement or say something. Like, is it fear? Is it guilt? Is it like, I don't want to be called out, so I'm going to say something? Because those things are not sustainable. You can't live in that space forever. You know, you can't stay in that space of like, like you kind of have to wait for it to go down into your stomach, and then when it's there, then you probably will want to continue to be there for that community. Like, you know, lots of people were talking about at the beginning of lockdown, oh, disabled people, now we can make change. And then as soon as it's like we can go back to like meeting face to face again, it's like, oh yeah, quick, great, we can do it. And then everyone's off, and now people are asking me to meet face to face. And I was isolating from almost about the 12th of March, and that was before everyone was in lockdown, obviously. And then everyone was a bit like, really, is that what you're gonna do? Like, it was like I was like being a bit criticized for it. And then even after, the other day I got asked to lead a workshop in a school, and I was like, no. Do you know what I mean? I was like, no, like, what? I'm just like, I don't know what's not clicked. So it was that thing of like, the change hasn't gone down what I say into the stomach. It's just stayed in the bit of your throat, and then you said something really quickly, and actually you haven't digested it. So I'd like to see people not be so worried about being reactionary in that moment, in that space, and actually thinking, is what I'm saying true to me and something that I really want to uphold and make a change in my life, and then say something? Because I think it gives, for me, I felt that sense of grief, the false sense of security that I felt in spaces, because it's like, oh, we're moving, and it's like, oh, no, we're not. It's actually exactly majority of the time the same. I mean, I don't mean like some of the bigger movements. I feel like Black Lives Matter something has shifted, but those of us who are probably in community organizing or want to be activists for a long time know that the shift is like that, and it's going to take a long time really for some of the things to be in place. Doesn't mean we shouldn't do it, but I think those people who have maybe just said something for the first time are surprised now when it's like, oh, it's been 4 months, like, why haven't people stopped their racism now? Do you know what I mean? Or why are people not transphobic, or why are people not ableist? And so I just want people to stop and pause and think and reflect and feel and speak when they're ready to speak, I think, maybe.
Yeah. Can I carry on from that? I just, it's exactly what I thought when you first spoke about that kind of performative activism, that I feel like, again, it comes from like the wider cultural model. It's like we're encouraged, like, to our whole lives really, to cover over shame, you know, and to not go near that, particularly that feelings like fear and shame. But I think shame is the really big one here. And I feel like, so what happens is people either you're so overwhelmed by the shame that you do nothing, you know, or you do that kind of quick cover up. And I think that a lot of that kind of really quick response comes from that place. And I just couldn't agree with you more. I think, again, that's what we get from, reading more Indigenous wisdom. That's what we get from thinking about, that kind of sense of like, just slow it down, like move away from that very fast-paced kind of surveillance capitalist model to this, like, how can we sit with this discomfort, you know? And it's really about the avoiding that, sitting with the discomfort. And again, it strikes me that this, you know, all these themes kind of come together here, because I think the approaches I find best for my own kind of personal mental health are very much about that. It's very much about like, how can I stay with this feeling? How can I really notice the things that I do to avoid staying with the feeling, which are often the things that really hurt me? And could I get underneath them and just be with the oh, actually, it's okay here. It's really uncomfortable, but it's okay. The thing that was really hurting me was all of the things I was doing to try and not like be here with this feeling. And then when it's like acting out in the world, as you say, then hopefully I can do it from a much more authentic place. I can really think, like, what do I have to give? What don't? Where are my limits? You know, where am I actually going to be helpful? And also notice that discomfort of like, oh, I think I want to do this thing because it's, you know, going to get me a cookie, or it's going to get some nice response from somebody else. I'm not doing it from that real authentic place of like, this could be genuinely like a collectively helpful thing to do. So yeah, just really agree with that.
In terms of the question of like what might be better, I think it's really become like more and more important for me to like center marginalized voices. And by that, I mean like in terms of like what we need, in terms of, and particularly material needs, because we were talking about mental health, like it's a massive impact on your mental health if you're not getting your material needs. And I think that's what I realized with so much of my organizing as well. It was just like, I wasn't in it. I was caring for everyone else, as we were talking about, and like my needs weren't being met. So that's not good. And yeah, and I think that constantly morphs, right? It's like, it's really hard to hold those feelings of shame that you're talking about, MJ, and avoid tokenism, as you were talking about, Suriya. Like, I think like it's really easy to fall into those things. And it is a fragility in a way. Sometimes it's trauma, and sometimes it's just fragility, and sometimes they're the same, and sometimes it's privilege. I remember having a conversation where someone in a social space that I was working in was being called out about racism. It was a white person, and they were just like, well, I'm Antifa, I can't be racist. I was like, that's not how that works. And it's just like this fragility of just like, no, like that's a bad thing, you can't call me that. Rather than holding the complexity that we're all learning, we're all missing some part of the puzzle. You know, people might be really, really hot on trans stuff, but they miss trans misogyny. It's not, and I think like it kind of erases some of those complexities that we'll have. It's not the same to be poor and trans as it is to be rich and trans. It's not the same to be white and trans and to be black and trans. It's not the same to be trans feminine as trans masculine. So, you know, I think there's like, we want things to be simple sometimes. We want to just be like, I'm a good person, I don't make mistakes. The world is too complicated, I'm going to make it really, really simple and kind of squish everything together. And risk is all the same, and all these groups are all the same. And that doesn't really get us anywhere, honestly. Like, I think and it's really hard. And I think it's a really hard, like I face that, I think we all do, holding that level of complexity, holding ourselves accountable, and also recognizing that we make mistakes and we're learning. So like, not just throwing ourselves in the trash, which is like disposability culture. I think of it, it's just like, you made one mistake, we're throwing you out. I mean, it's classist and it's ableist. Like, to get everything exactly right, we need to be really on our shit, and sometimes we're not. And we're learning, right? I'm not saying like people make mistakes and forgive them. I'm saying just like, you know, like we're all learning, we're in a process. So I think like spaces that collectively we hold each other accountable, and we also forgive each other a little bit. And I do think that's a marginalized experience. Like, I do think that this idea, and I have it a lot in Berlin, of like middle class culture, where you can just kind of throw people away because they, you know, they've been cancelled. And I'm like, I never did that. When you're all just like 10 people and a cat surviving on the edge, you can't throw each other away so easily. We have to like work through it. We have to do the collective work to keep each other a little bit. We're not so disposable, you know. I don't throw away my stuff, I don't throw away my people either. Like, we have to like hold on and do that extra work, which is a lot more work than just being like, no, well, you haven't met my very specific criteria that I just invented, and you're cancelled. There's something harder to hold that complexity.
Yeah, I'm such a big fan of creating space to make mistakes and to learn. Yeah, our communities are already small. Like, we don't need to kick people out. Like, yeah, for me as well, thinking about what I would like to see changes. Also what Suriya said, you know, just people like us, individuals, really reflecting on ourselves, really thinking about our position in communities, and also like who's actually in the communities that we're working with or trying to impact. And we'll find that there are young people, people of color, disabled people, working class people, people who don't have access to Instagram, to social media, people who aren't in cities, who are in rural areas, trans people. And when trans, say for example, when trans people are like suffering or facing injustice, then the whole LGBTQ community is suffering. We need to really think about it like that, I think. Sorry, I know it's really dark here. It's actually the middle of the day, but it looks like it's the middle of the night. The other thing I wanted to say was to talk a bit about intentions, which Suriya also mentioned about the kind of motivations behind what we're doing. For me, intention is a really important part of my my Islam, and I think a lot about what are my intentions behind many things, and what's my intention behind driving change. And that word the word longevity and sustainability comes up for me, and I think I want to see us doing that more. And I think, kind of echoing what's been said already, that is, building a sustainable movement is going to look like doing nothing or taking steps back, but actually it's a bigger picture, long-term thing. And I think that's really hard actually in a pandemic, in lockdown, when everything is so reactionary, and we can't, like, you know, we can't see, time doesn't make sense anymore, and we can't see the long-term movement because we're so focused on right now. But I wrote about this. It's something called the movement cycle by NetLab, which maybe we can link to later if people want to look at that, and how a movement, what a movement really looks like, and that what we're seeing now, or on social media, or on you know, live feeds and stuff, is just the peak of a movement. But actually, there's a whole wave, a whole cycle of it all, and that's what I want us to think about. And I think care is a part of that. You know, I care about this cause, so I'm going to take my time with it. Yeah.
I just wanted to say that I really loved what you were talking about in terms of longevity and like seeing like the bigger picture of movements in a way. And I think I've really experienced that in places where I've been organizing that are very like intergenerational. So there will be like older people who've been doing it for decades and decades, and there's younger people and they have like a different perspective. And like, I think when those perspectives come together, it can be something really amazing. That often I feel like we're missing. Often like everyone in the room is kind of around the same age or something. And I'm like, but like, where are the people who've been doing this forever? Where are the people who just came into this and like have like this like new perspective or something? I feel like there's something very enriching and challenging often as well with having those intergenerational conversations. And yeah, it's something I'm often missing in a way. And yeah, I think sometimes that can be ageism. It can be ageism against young people or older people, anyone who's a different age. And I think that there's something so powerful in like knowing that, like, I don't know, when we speak about like second wave feminists, some of them were trans, and like, where did they all go? Where are those stories? And I think there's something so beautiful when I'm hanging out with like my elders who are like constantly educating me. And yeah, I think like that conversation can be so beautiful, because then we're not like, oh, it's like right now and it's like right this moment and there's nothing else. And I think that's something that we were talking about as well. It's like understanding there'll be like something very visible, and as you're saying, it's like a peak. But often we're like, well, we've been doing this forever. Like this is not something that just appeared yesterday and like is going to disappear tomorrow. It's like it's yeah, there's like a curve, as you're saying, like a cycle, I guess. I just love that, what you're talking about.
Suriya, I know this is something that I think you particularly want to speak to, and of course that, you know, you're based, and you know, your organising is also based in Birmingham, I believe, as well. I mean, I know it's online as well, but was regionality something you wanted to talk about in terms of kind of activism?
Yeah, I think it's an important thing to raise, actually. I think so I live in Manchester, but I do a lot of work still in Birmingham. I mean, everything's online at the moment, but yeah, so I'm from Birmingham, and I think it was connected to what you said earlier about the commodification of queerness a lot of the time, and how that intersects with class and who has access to some of the like being real, some of the paid opportunities that happen within our community. And a lot of the time it's centered on those who are organizing or based in London. So, and I think, so it's not just about, there's the visibility of it, but then there's also like an underlying thing that I think people are a bit reticent to talk about the distribution of wealth amongst queer communities. Because if you go to every event and there's always London speakers who are booked, what does that mean? You know, we have to ask questions about what that means. And it's like, and I think sometimes it's a difficult thing to raise because, you know, I think if on a real human level, you're worried about coming across as like, are you bitter? Are you jealous? Are you something, you know, and it's not just about that. It's about the fact of, okay, we've done the first level of work of representation. Now it's time for us to have the more difficult conversations about what kind of representation and how is the visibility distributed? How is the wealth distributed? And also for me, working a lot with, you know, there's a lot of vulnerable people in Birmingham because the access to our services are really poor just for the baseline kind of mental health support. Youth support is really, and it's a massive city with one council, which is really makes a lot of things really difficult. Whereas, you know, in London, even though it's bigger, it has a lot more points of reference. So we're all going to the centre, which means that with Unmuted, for example, in the network, there's lots and lots of very vulnerable people. And then I think I commented on a thread or a kind of conversation that was going on Twitter earlier this year, where people were just like taking the mick out of the Birmingham accent. And it's like, yeah, okay, it's funny to a certain degree, but after a while, it's like there are people living there actually, and there are people who, the more you make their city butt of jokes, how do you think it makes people in that city feel? And young people in that city feel, and people feel like, you know, one of the reasons Unmuted was started was because people felt like they had to go to London or other bigger cities because there was no other queer people, especially queer people of colour in the city. It doesn't have as big as of a queer scene as like London or Manchester. So I'm really passionate actually about the fact that we don't just keep getting into these really like what start off as like jokes, rhetoric about certain cities, because people live there. And also it feeds in then to when you go to panels or you go to events, why there's only representation from London, which also has the majority of a lot of resources already, which are steered there. And then a lot of like bigger companies, even though you know, it's about rainbow capitalism is not great, but that's still a monetary sponsorship sometimes to organizations. And that goes then again to London. So you have all this kind of really lots and lots of over-resourcing in one city. And actually that's how I felt as an organizer. It's like you're trying to, for years, to kind of get a little bit of support or attention, which is for the people, for the community that are there, which suffer, and often people don't really see that side of it.
But I'm aware of the time, you know, and you've all been really generous with your time as well. Has anybody got any kind of a closing comment or a comment that they like to share, even if it's just you know, just kind of how they found this session? That might be a nice way to close it, with your voices rather than, you know, my voice.
I suppose just picking up on what Suriya was just talking about, there's something really important about thinking about where the wealth's distributed, isn't there? And it makes me think about how when we look at LGBTQ plus and mental health, you know, where the stats are is that the worst mental health is in the B and the T and the Q, but the money often goes to the G and a bit to the L. Similarly, you know, when we differentiate with race, we see that the worst mental health is happening people who are multiply marginalised, but you know, most of the money is going to white spaces. And similarly, when we look to like urban and rural, a similar, you know, there's much worse mental health for LGBTQ plus people in rural areas, but the money goes to the urban centres and particularly to London. So I just think that's a useful kind of ending point really to what we've been saying, is like really thinking where that goes, both in terms of like who's platformed, like Suriya was saying, and whether we can do more to ensure that different voices are platformed, but also like where does the wealth going to the folks whose mental health is most impacted, or is the almost that fact of worse? It's the way it gets put together. It's like, oh, LGBTQ plus people have worse mental health than heteronormative people, so let's give them some money. But then it all goes to the primarily white, gay kind of urban groups who are actually not the ones who are having the highest levels of mental health problems.
Kes and Sabah, would you like to say anything before we finish?
Sure. I think to try and like wrap up what everyone has been saying, and particularly what MJ was talking about earlier about staying with feelings, I think for you as an individual watching this, like feel your feelings, like feel the shame or the guilt or the fear that, you know, you're experiencing, you're feeling, but don't let that hold you there. Like feel it, okay, experience it, and then make a change or do something, and think about what your real intention is behind that change. Yeah.
I love that. Yeah, I think, yeah, I wanted to like thank Suriya, especially for like mentioning that like regionality difference, and also Aimz because I think, you know, as you were saying, sometimes you're mentioning this thing and people are like, well, are you just bitter? And that really stuck in my head, because I think that that's often what happens when we call out power dynamics and double standards. And this is another power dynamic and a double standard. And double standard, I mean like one rule for somebody and one rule for somebody else. And I think that, yeah, I think it's something that was in the air earlier as well, that of like this idea of just like complexity and being able to hold like all of those, and knowing that we're always going to be missing something. You know, like I've often been like, I don't know, involved in creating a space or something, and there's like 3 subjects, and we're dealing with those 3 subjects, and it's kind of infinite. Like there's myriad double standards. It'll be, you know, somebody will come in and be like, wait, like I can't sit on these seats, they're too narrow for my body. And you're like, okay, well, we didn't think about that, but that's really important. Or they're like, well, why is this happening in this place? There's stairs. Okay. And it's not just access, right? It's like, it's just when we're co-designing our spaces, just like being open to all of those double standards that we're like receiving or reproducing. I don't know where these words are coming from, but you know what I mean? Like there's always more things than we know. And even if we're like, I think it's also what you were saying earlier, just like slowing down, being open to it, not reacting immediately and be like, no, but we've dealt with this one thing and that's the only thing we're going to talk about. It's like, no, there might be more things. There's loads of different power dynamics. There's going to be loads of different double standards. We can work on all of them. And it's, you know, like there's like being realistic and pragmatic, but you know, that's like something that maybe people don't think about in London. So maybe that's something that's really important to bring up in a conversation. And yeah, so I think just like being able to hold this complexity as groups, also as individuals, and just being like, wow, I didn't see that, I missed that thing. I need to do some work. Not I'm going to be either like super defensive and say, no, that's not a thing, I don't care about your oppression, or feeling really shamed or avoiding it. All of these things, just like, okay, I don't have that experience. I totally missed it. I'm not going to miss it the next time. I'm going to do some work. And we can hold ourselves to that. We can hold spaces where we do that. And yeah, to actually finish, I just thank you so much. Like I have so much respect for you all, and I feel like I have a lot of things to learn now, and I need to like process things and like think about things. And that was just really beautiful. And yeah, actually an honor to be here. I really appreciate it. And thank you for the organizing as well.
Oh, thank you, Kes, as well, and thank you. I mean, Sabah, Kes, MJ, Suriya. It's been an absolute honour. Like I was so nervous to start with, just because, you know, I know, you know, all of your work. I know sort of like flagged like MJ, but it's also like, you know, I've just got so much admiration for, you know, all the work that you do, and I know there was a couple of questions when we were organising about, or I'm not sure, you know, I'll be able to speak to this, but you know, myself and Akiko, like Amy, like we knew, we just knew, because it's exactly this kind of conversation that I hoped would happen, which is, you know, what you've just been talking about at the end there is like how all these things intersect and speak to each other, and perhaps actually, you know, Sabah and Kes, what you were saying then, actually is a really nice perhaps takeaway. If there's one thing about kind of relationship between, you know, user survivor activism and mental health groups and LGBTQ plus groups, perhaps it is this sense of, like I said, being comfortable, of sitting with, you know, of being in your feelings, of sitting with what's going on, you know, of not reacting, because actually so often, as you know, mental health user survivors, as LGBTQ folks, as, you know, people from racialized communities, etc., as disabled people, we're so used to people being reactive against us, no matter how else we identify. So I think that's a really lovely lesson, and it's like something that's more kind of politically robust than saying be kind, which I know has come in for a lot of stick lately. But I think that idea of actually of being sort of open and willing to listen, and realizing that it's a longer journey, is something that mental health user survivors and LGBTQ folks, you know, are very aware of as well. So we'll stop the recording there. I'll as a part of the recording, I will say thank you again to Sabah, Kes, Suriya, and MJ, and thank you so much to Amy and Rory for helping organise and support this. And yes, please do enjoy the rest of the AGM. So thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks so much. Thank you.